Before the door closed on countless young brides throughout history, their fates had already been sealed by traditions far darker than anyone dares to speak about today. Marriage wasn't just a union. It was a theater of control, humiliation, and violence disguised as custom. What happened behind those closed doors on wedding nights across different cultures has been deliberately buried, sanitized, and forgotten. If you're drawn to the hidden corners of history where innocence was systematically destroyed, subscribe. This isn't folklore. This is the documented reality of practices that turned what should have been private moments into public spectacles of degradation. Before the celebrations ended, before the last guest departed, young women faced rituals designed to break their spirits and assert dominion over their bodies and souls. Comment where you're watching from and stay with me. Because the wedding itself wasn't the tragedy. What came after the ceremony was far more sinister. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, the tradition known as the bedding ceremony transformed wedding nights into orchestrated nightmares. While modern couples imagine privacy and intimacy following their vows, brides from the 12th through the 17th centuries faced something entirely different. The bedding ceremony was not a quiet affair. It was a raucous, invasive ritual where wedding guests, family members, and sometimes complete strangers physically escorted the newlyweds to their marriage bed. The bride, already exhausted from hours of ceremony and feast, would be surrounded by crowds of people, their faces flushed with wine and excitement. Men would grab at her clothing, laughing as they removed layers of her wedding attire. Women would offer crude advice, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. The young woman at the center of this chaos had no choice but to endure it. Refusal meant scandal. Resistance meant shame upon her entire family. The procession itself was designed to humiliate. Guests would parade through corridors and hallways, carrying torches and singing body songs that described in explicit detail what was expected to happen once the door finally closed. The bride's clothing would be torn away piece by piece, each removal met with cheers and jeers. By the time she reached the bedroom, she wore only her shift, a thin undergarment that provided neither warmth nor dignity. The groom fared little better, stripped to his underclothes by his companions, though the mockery directed at him carried a different tone. His humiliation was temporary, a rite of passage that would end with the assertion of his marital rights. Hers was the beginning of a lifetime of submission. Once inside the chamber, the couple was not left alone immediately. Witnesses remained, sometimes for hours, ensuring the marriage would be consummated. In noble families, the stakes were even higher. The continuation of bloodlines, the legitimacy of heirs, the validity of political alliances, all depended on proof that the marriage had been completed. Guests would wait outside the door, listening for sounds that confirmed the deed. In some regions, they demanded visible evidence. Bloodstained sheets would be displayed the following morning, held up for inspection like trophies. A young bride's most private moment became public property, her body transformed into a battlefield where family honor was won or lost. The psychological toll cannot be measured. These women, many of them barely past childhood, entered marriage already traumatized by the spectacle of their own wedding night. They had been taught from birth that their worth resided in their virginity, their obedience, and their ability to produce male heirs. The bedding ceremony reinforced every lesson. It stripped away any illusion of autonomy. It declared loudly and publicly that their bodies no longer belonged to themselves. Historical records from this period reveal that some brides went to extraordinary lengths to avoid the ceremony. They begged their fathers for private weddings. They pleaded with their husbands to dispense with tradition. But custom held absolute power, and individual suffering meant nothing when weighed against centuries of practice. Travel eastward across medieval trade routes, and the rituals grew even darker. In certain regions of Central Asia and parts of the Middle East, wedding nights involved practices that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The tradition of bride capture, while often romanticized in ancient poetry and folklore, had its roots in actual violence. Young women were sometimes taken by force from neighboring villages or nomadic groups, their abductions framed as acceptable courtship. By the time these practices evolved into symbolic rituals, the psychological damage remained embedded in the ceremonies themselves. A bride might be chased, caught, and carried off by her groom and his companions in a theatrical display that mimicked genuine kidnapping. The line between performance and reality blurred dangerously, especially for the young woman at the center who had been conditioned to view such treatment as normal. In other communities, wedding night traditions involve physical examinations conducted by elder women of the village. The new bride would be subjected to invasive inspections meant to verify her virginity before consummation. These examinations were not medical procedures performed with care or discretion. They were communal events, attended by multiple witnesses, discussed openly and without shame. The bride's protests were dismissed as modesty or nerves. Her pain was expected. Her humiliation was tradition. Afterward, she would be prepared for her husband like an offering, adorned with oils and perfumes, dressed in garments designed to emphasize her vulnerability. When he entered the chamber, she was expected to be silent, compliant, grateful even. The concept of consent did not exist in any meaningful way. Marriage itself was considered blanket permission for anything that followed. The practice of displaying blood-stained sheets reached particularly grotesque heights in parts of Mediterranean Europe and North Africa. Families would gather outside the newlyweds' chamber at dawn, waiting for the moment when proof of consummation could be presented. In some villages, the stained cloth would be hung from balconies or paraded through streets. Celebratory gunfire would erupt. Women would ululate in triumph. But beneath the celebration lurked an ugly truth. If no blood appeared, if the bride failed to provide visible evidence of her lost virginity, she faced accusations of dishonor that could destroy her life. She might be sent back to her family in disgrace. She might face violence from her new husband. In extreme cases, she might be killed to restore family honor. The pressure on these young women was so intense that some resorted to deception. They would hide vials of animal blood in their clothing or use sharp objects to create wounds that mimicked the expected result. Their terror drove them to self-harm in order to survive. Historical documents from the Ottoman Empire reveal another disturbing tradition that persisted for centuries. Young brides entering the imperial harem faced wedding night rituals that combined religious ceremony with calculated cruelty. The bride would be bathed and perfumed by attendants, her body hair removed according to strict guidelines, her skin treated with henna and oils. Then she would be led through darkened corridors to the sultan's chambers. But the path she walked was lined with other women, concubines, and wives who had preceded her, each one a reminder of her expendability. If she pleased the sultan, she might gain status and protection. If she failed to satisfy him, she would be relegated to the forgotten corners of the harem, her value reduced to nothing. The wedding night itself was a test she could not afford to fail, yet she had received no preparation beyond vague warnings and contradictory advice. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the physical acts. These brides were taught to view their own suffering as natural and necessary. They were told that pain proved virtue, that resistance indicated moral failing, that acceptance demonstrated proper feminine character. Religious authorities across different faiths reinforced these messages. Marriage manuals from medieval Christianity instructed women to submit without complaint. Islamic scholarship of certain periods emphasized wifely obedience above all other qualities. Hindu texts described the ideal wife as one who treated her husband as a god, regardless of his treatment of her. Buddhist communities were not immune either. Despite philosophical teachings about compassion and non-harm, cultural practices surrounding marriage often subjected women to rituals that contradicted those very principles. In feudal Japan, wedding night traditions reflected the rigid social hierarchies that governed every aspect of life. A samurai bride entering her husband's household faced ceremonies designed to demonstrate her inferior position. She would kneel before her new family, her forehead touching the floor in a gesture of absolute submission. Her wedding night attire was carefully chosen to emphasize her role as property transferred from one family to another. The elaborate layers of kimono would be removed by female attendants while the groom watched, a symbolic unwrapping that reduced the bride to an object acquired through negotiation. Once alone with her husband, she was expected to remain passive and silent. Any expression of personality, any hint of desire or preference, could be interpreted as unseemly boldness that brought shame to her natal family. The documentation of these practices exists not in grand historical texts, but in the margins. Personal letters from women who survived these ordeals occasionally surface in archives. A bride from 15th century Florence wrote to her sister describing her terror on her wedding night, the roughness of hands that held her down, the pain that no one had warned her about, the blood that everyone demanded to see. Her letter was discovered centuries later, folded inside a prayer book, a secret testimony to suffering that was meant to remain hidden. Another account from 17th century England came from a midwife's journal. She described being called to examine a bride whose wedding night had resulted in serious injury. The young woman's family, more concerned with potential scandal than her well-being, had tried to keep the matter private. The midwife's carefully coded language suggests horrors she dared not state explicitly, but her anger burned through every line. Perhaps most disturbing were the traditions surrounding child brides. Marriages arranged when girls were barely past infancy and consummated when they reached puberty or sometimes even before. In various cultures across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, families betrothed their daughters at young ages for political alliance, economic advantage, or social climbing. The wedding ceremony might be delayed until the girl matured, but in many cases it was not. Records from medieval Europe contain numerous examples of marriages consummated when the bride was 12, 11, even younger. The physical damage inflicted on these children's bodies was catastrophic. The psychological trauma was lifelong. Yet the practice continued because custom demanded it, because dowries had been paid, because contracts had been signed. The girl's suffering was irrelevant compared to the social and economic arrangements that marriage represented. The bedding ceremony in aristocratic circles often involved even more elaborate humiliations. In the French court during the 16th and 17th centuries, royal weddings culminated in ceremonies where the bride and groom were literally put to bed by their attendants while courtiers watched. The couple would lie side by side, sometimes with a wooden board placed between them if the bride was deemed too young for immediate consummation, while bishops offered blessings and nobles made ribald jokes. The bride's nightgown would be inspected beforehand to ensure it provided appropriate access. Her hair would be arranged in specific ways meant to ease removal. Every detail was orchestrated to reduce the most intimate of human experiences to a public performance where the woman's personhood disappeared entirely. Some cultures incorporated violence directly into wedding night rituals. In certain tribal communities, the groom was expected to demonstrate his dominance through physical force. The bride's resistance, whether genuine or performed, was considered necessary to the ritual. She was supposed to fight back, to make him prove his strength and ability to control her. What this meant in practice was sanctioned assault, violence dressed up as tradition and cheered on by witnesses. Anthropologists who studied these practices in the 19th and early 20th centuries often described them with detached academic language that failed to acknowledge the trauma being inflicted. They spoke of symbolic domination and ritualized conflict, using terminology that obscured the reality of what was happening. A young woman, sometimes still a girl, was being hurt deliberately as part of her initiation into married life. The aftermath of these wedding nights shaped everything that followed. Women who had been traumatized by the rituals often carried that trauma into motherhood, passing anxiety and fear to their daughters even as they tried to prepare them for similar ordeals. The cycle perpetuated itself across generations. Mothers told daughters that suffering was normal, that pain was expected, that submission was the only path to survival. They shared techniques for enduring, methods for hiding discomfort, strategies for managing male violence. What they could not share was genuine preparation or protection. because the structures that permitted these rituals were too powerful to challenge. Religious institutions that might have spoken against such practices instead sanctified them. Church wedding ceremonies across Christian denominations included language that explicitly subordinated wives to husbands. The bride was instructed to obey. The groom was given authority. The consummation that followed was framed as the fulfillment of divine will. Islamic wedding contracts included stipulations about obedience and access. Hindu ceremonies incorporated rituals that symbolically transferred ownership of the bride from her father to her husband. The sacred texts that supposedly guided these faiths contained passages about compassion, kindness, and mutual respect. But those teachings were conveniently forgotten when it came to wedding night practices. Some women found ways to resist, though their options were severely limited. A few wealthy brides managed to negotiate terms before marriage, using their family's power to demand certain protections. Others fled, choosing disgrace over the ritual humiliation awaiting them. Historical records contain scattered references to runaway brides who disappeared on their wedding days, preferring uncertain futures to certain trauma. Most, however, had no such choices. They went forward because there was no going back, because their families had already received payment, because backing out would destroy not just their own lives, but the lives of parents and siblings who depended on the alliance. The rare voices that spoke against these practices were silenced quickly. When a medieval nun named Hildegard von Bingen wrote about the suffering of young brides and suggested that violent consummation was sinful regardless of marital status, her writings on the subject were largely ignored by church authorities. When an Ottoman court poet dared to compose verses describing a bride's terror on her wedding night, his work was banned and he faced accusations of bringing shame to honorable customs. Progressive voices existed in every era and every culture, but they struggled against centuries of entrenched tradition backed by legal systems, religious authorities, and social structures that all benefited from women's subordination. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of middle classes in Europe and North America gradually began to shift attitudes, though change came painfully slowly. The Victorian era is often remembered for its prudishness, but that surface modesty concealed ongoing cruelties. Middle-class Victorian brides went to their marriage beds almost entirely ignorant of what would happen there. Mothers refused to explain. Books on the subject were forbidden. The wedding night became a moment of shock and horror for women who had been kept deliberately uninformed. When they emerged traumatized, their complaints were dismissed as hysteria. Medical professionals of the era actually prescribed marriage as a cure for female nervous conditions, apparently oblivious to the fact that wedding night trauma was causing many of those conditions in the first place. Even as some traditions faded in industrialized nations, they persisted elsewhere and sometimes intensified. Colonial powers exported European marriage customs to conquered territories, often combining the worst aspects of indigenous traditions with Victorian repressiveness. The result was hybrid practices that maximize control over women while stripping away whatever protections might have existed in pre-colonial systems. A young bride in colonial India might face both traditional family examinations and new Victorian expectations of silent suffering. A woman in colonized Africa might endure both indigenous initiation rites and Christian marriage ceremonies that doubled the rituals of subordination she had to undergo. The 20th century brought gradual reforms, driven largely by women's movements that fought for basic rights and dignity. But changing laws proved easier than changing attitudes. Even after legal protections were established, even after marital rape was recognized as a crime in progressive jurisdictions, the cultural legacy of these traditions lingered. Women still absorbed messages about wifely duty, about enduring discomfort for the sake of marriage, about prioritizing male satisfaction over their own well-being. The explicit rituals might have faded, but their psychological impact echoed through generations. Today, in certain communities around the world, variations of these practices continue. Young women still face virginity testing in some regions. Wedding night expectations still include proof of purity. Families still involve themselves in their children's intimate lives in ways that violate basic privacy and dignity. International human rights organizations document these ongoing abuses, but cultural relativism and respect for tradition often prevent meaningful intervention. The same arguments that protected these practices centuries ago are still deployed today. This is our custom. This is our culture. Outsiders cannot understand. And so the suffering continues, hidden behind closed doors, erased from official histories, spoken about only in whispers. The erasure itself is part of the crime. By refusing to acknowledge these practices, by sanitizing the past and romanticizing historical marriage, modern culture perpetuates the silence that allowed abuse to flourish. When period dramas depict beautiful weddings and fade to black before the bedroom door closes, they participate in the cover-up. When historians write about royal marriages and political alliances without mentioning the trauma inflicted on young brides, they become complicit in the erasure. The women who suffered deserve to have their stories told, not as titillating historical curiosities, but as testimonies to systemic cruelty that societies chose to permit. Understanding these practices requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how marriage has functioned throughout most of human history. It was not primarily about love or companionship. It was a system for controlling reproduction, transferring property, and maintaining social hierarchies. Women's bodies were the terrain on which these arrangements played out. The wedding night rituals that seemed so shocking to modern sensibilities were simply the most concentrated expression of violence that permeated the entire institution. The public nature of many ceremonies served a purpose beyond ensuring consummation. They established witnesses to the transfer of property. They created community investment in maintaining the marriage regardless of the bride's suffering. They sent a message to every watching woman that this was her fate too, that resistance was futile, that the best she could hope for was to endure with dignity. The few women who managed to document their experiences left records that are difficult to read. Their pain seeps through carefully chosen words and coded language. A letter from a 19th century American bride describes her wedding night in terms so veiled that the full horror only becomes clear after several readings. She writes of her husband's impatience, of her own confusion and terror, of pain she had not anticipated and blood that frightened her. She mentions that her mother had warned her to submit without complaint, advice that now haunted her as she lay awake beside a man she barely knew. The letter ends with a prayer that her daughter, if she has one, might be spared similar suffering. That prayer was not answered for most of the generations that followed. Medical records from various eras contain evidence of the physical toll these practices took. Physicians treating young married women documented injuries that could only have resulted from violent assault, yet they carefully avoided accusations or judgments. The injuries were recorded as complications of marriage, natural consequences of wifely duty. When women died from infections or internal trauma following wedding nights, their deaths were attributed to weakness of constitution or divine will, never to the violence inflicted upon them. The medical profession's complicity in maintaining silence about marital violence extended for centuries and continues in some forms even today. Legal systems across cultures established marriage as a zone where normal rules did not apply. A man could not be charged with raping his own wife because the marriage contract was understood to include perpetual consent. This legal framework meant that wedding night violence, no matter how extreme, had no remedy. A bride who emerged from her chamber with visible injuries had no recourse. She could not seek legal protection. She could not return to her family without bringing shame upon them. She could only endure and hope that future encounters would be less traumatic. Some women spent their entire married lives in a state of endurance, waiting for circumstances to improve or for death to bring release. The intergenerational transmission of trauma created communities where women collectively carried the weight of these practices without being able to name or challenge them. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters all bore similar scars, yet they could not speak openly about their experiences. The silence was enforced by shame, by social pressure, by the very real threat of being ostracized if they broke the code of secrecy surrounding marital intimacy. In tight-knit communities, a woman who complained about her husband's treatment risked not just her own reputation, but her family's position in the social hierarchy. Better to suffer in silence than to speak truth and face collective punishment. Modern efforts to address these historical injustices face significant resistance. When academics and activists attempt to document and analyze wedding night rituals, they often encounter accusations of imposing contemporary values on the past or disrespecting cultural traditions. But the women who suffered through these rituals did not experience them as neutral cultural practices. They experienced them as trauma, as violence, as violations of their fundamental humanity. The pain transcended cultural context. The fear was universal. The scars left by these rituals remained regardless of whether the surrounding society acknowledged them. Perhaps the most damning aspect of this hidden history is how thoroughly it has been erased from collective memory. Most people learn about royal weddings and noble marriages without ever hearing about the bedding ceremonies. Students study medieval European history without encountering descriptions of what wedding nights actually entailed. The glossy surface of historical romance obscures the ugly reality beneath. This erasure serves a purpose. It allows contemporary societies to imagine that the past was more civilized than it actually was. It prevents uncomfortable questions about how quickly genuine progress has been made and how much work remains to be done. The wedding night rituals that history tried to erase tell us essential truths about power, control, and the systematic subordination of women. They reveal how societies have used tradition to justify cruelty, how institutions have protected abusers, and how silence has been weaponized to maintain systems of oppression. Breaking that silence, naming these practices clearly and honestly, becomes an act of historical justice. The women who suffered cannot be helped now, but their stories can be told. Their experiences can be validated. The erasure can be reversed. When we look at wedding ceremonies today, when we watch brides walk down aisles and exchange vows, we should remember the countless women who preceded them. We should acknowledge the trauma that was considered normal for so many generations. We should recognize that the freedoms many brides now take for granted, the right to choose their partners, the right to refuse unwanted intimacy, the right to leave abusive marriages, were won through centuries of struggle against traditions that treated women as property. The battle is not over. In too many places, wedding night rituals still inflict trauma. In too many cultures, young brides still face expectations that prioritize their husband's desires over their own well-being. History tried to erase these rituals because acknowledging them would require confronting uncomfortable questions about the societies that permitted them. It would force recognition that the past was not a golden age of chivalry and romance, but an era of systematic violence against women. It would demand accounting for the institutions, laws, and customs that enabled these practices to continue for so long. By pulling these rituals out of the shadows, by insisting on honest documentation and unflinching analysis, we honor the women who survived them and the countless others who did not. Their stories become testament to human resilience, even as they indict the systems that made such resilience necessary. The sinister wedding night rituals of history were not aberrations. They were features of marriage systems designed to subordinate women from their first moments as wives. The public humiliation, the physical violence, the psychological trauma, all serve to establish and maintain male dominance within the most intimate of relationships. That these practices have been largely erased from popular historical narratives reveals ongoing discomfort with confronting the full truth of women's historical experiences. But truth cannot be erased forever. The evidence exists in scattered documents, coded letters, medical records, and the testimonies passed down through generations of women who warned their daughters about what awaited them. If this hidden history has moved you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told and remembered, support continued research and documentation by sharing this knowledge. The women who suffered through these rituals were silenced in their own time. We can refuse to silence them now. Their experiences form an essential part of human history that must be acknowledged, studied, and never forgotten. Share your thoughts about these practices and their legacy. History tried to erase these rituals, but memory and truth prove more resilient than silence and shame.